What? Did you hear from them?
We're live.
I heard that. Yeah.
We're live. Oh, great. Okay.
Oh, yeah, he's fine.
Oh, okay. Good morning. It is Wednesday, January 29th. This is Sunday Natural Resources and Energy. And we are gonna have a relatively short agenda today. We had some cancellations, and so I'm excited though to be welcoming Lauren Oates from the Nature Conservancy. Just come tell us about river corridors. Thank you for your flexibility last time, coming back today. So good. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Good morning, committee. For the record, Lauren Oates, Director of External Affairs with the Nature Conservancy of Vermont. I was looking back at the slides I sent last week and realizing I was, bifurcated from Karina Daly at the NRC and kind of gave the overview of river corridors and floodplains and realizing if you all need a refresher on it, since it's been a whole week and a lot has happened, let me know. But I'm generally here to kind of talk about the different risk profiles between river corridors and floodplains, the cost of those damages to taxpayers of Vermont, and then some changes that were made last year via legislation that hope to correct some development challenges we've had in the past. But happy to answer any other.
Can I just ask one thing?
Yes.
Are your slides on our website?
They will be right.
Okay.
I didn't know she was gonna give me.
They were the same from last week,
Okay.
so hopefully they're.
It was taken. You can proceed though.
Okay. It's mostly just
It's on.
gripping photos.
Okay.
To kind of ground us in the reality here. All right, so primarily here to talk again about the differences between river corridors and floodplains and the different types of flooding that those two hazard areas within our river systems have. Primarily, we're talking about the difference between erosive flooding and inundation flooding. A river corridor, essentially, if I can bring you all back to like middle school math, is the x-axis flooding. It is the flooding that takes place when a river moves from side to side. It meanders within that corridor that Karina spoke to last week. Whereas inundation flooding is the flooding that you'll see in these photos from Waterbury and Montpelier, where it's essentially a bathtub is the y-axis flooding, where it slowly fills up and then slowly goes back down. Damage in inundation flooding is largely wet, just wet structures. A lot of things that get wet are damaged. Repair is extremely expensive, but structural damage is very, very minimal in inundation flooding. Erosive flooding, or flooding within that river corridor where a river will jump its bank and chart a new course entirely, is much more damaging and accounts for about 80% of flood-related damages in Vermont. Those are the photos that you can see from Route 4 on the top and down in Rochester, where what looks like a small brook actually can create massive harm and immense public safety threat. The issue between these two is, well, there are many actually. These two graphs or images rather, were pulled from the Agency of Natural Resources Atlas page. And you can see the yellow area, or the palish yellow, is the river corridor, whereas the red area is the FEMA defined floodplain. That's the 100-year floodplain. In this first photo from East Creek and Rutland, you'll see the floodplain looks a lot smaller in this area, and the river corridor is much wider. This poses an issue with how we assess and develop based on risk. FEMA, and I'll talk to this in a little bit, really only looks at the floodplain as a risk area. That's the inundation flooding. That's largely what you'll see in flatter areas around the country, Mississippi, big floods, coastal flooding that's not storm surge related. It's just that inundation flooding. It's generally easier to map, but it does not capture the risk of more mountainous or topographically challenged states like Vermont. This image is particularly valuable, I think, in telling the story of if you were to try to develop, in this case, critical infrastructure, this is a Vermont State Police Barracks, right off of Route 7. You can imagine during a flood, we need our police force to be able to get out and direct traffic, respond to any issues that are happening during a flood. And when they developed that, they might have seen, we're out of the floodplain, we're safe here. When in reality, they're actually much less safe because they're in the river corridor. This is the place where the East Creek can very easily, given a high precipitation event, jump its course and take out that facility entirely.
Is this commonly what they refer to, some people refer to as the floodway?
It's a little different. The floodway is also FEMA. It's a little bit smaller than the floodplain. And that is considered a highly dangerous area too, but it's smaller even than the floodplain and it doesn't account for
Okay.
that jumping of the banks. The second image represents a different problem with our mapping and risk assessment and development patterns in the state. This is taken from the Wardsboro Brook in Wardsboro, but you can find this exact image across the state, pretty much anywhere there is a river. Because our rivers move over time from side to side in the river corridors, there too means that the floodplain must move, but FEMA mapping takes a very long time. And it doesn't account for rivers that move side to side, it only thinks about those big rivers that generally are either straightened or kept in place. So this map, if you can see underneath, the river has shifted all the way out so that the floodplain in this image doesn't even account for where the river is currently, let alone where it will inundate. So those are two, maybe three reasons why accounting for river corridor and erosive flooding in Vermont has proven exceptionally challenging and has made it such that private property owners, public infrastructure, anything that has been developed using FEMA as its primary risk target has really missed mark.
Is that, what is, East Creek, is that, what, Norfolk problem?
It's just north of it.
Just north, yeah.
Yeah, of the downtown
Yeah.
center, yeah. You would have to turn off of Route 4 and the north. So I told you that some things shifted last year and we'll talk about changes that were made, but so this should say our old with an asterisk because it's still current regulatory framework compounded this issue of missing the mark on erosive development and being behind on FEMA mapped inundation flooding risk. And that's largely because rivers are inherently intermunicipal and the way that both river corridors and floodplains are regulated is very different and do not account for the fact that a river that starts in one town will necessarily flow through many towns before it leaves the city altogether. Floodplains are mapped and regulated by FEMA, but they are enforced by towns. I'm sure many of you have heard about the trials and tribulations of navigating the National Flood Insurance Program that your, especially rural towns, are trying to navigate. More than 90% of our towns are enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program, so most of our towns are in it, and that grants those private property owners in the town access to flood insurance, should they choose to get it or should they be required to. The issue again is that navigating the federal bureaucracy around FEMA and the regulations and the fact that the maps are often outdated is really hard for towns who are really overburdened already and trying to just navigate like how they're gonna pay for their salt shed for the year, let alone FEMA. And then again, the fact that the river corridors are not seen, erosive flooding is not seen as a risk that's captured in the FEMA risk profile presents an additional challenge. River corridors, they are mapped by the Department of Environmental Conservation within the ANR, and they are largely unregulated, with a few exceptions. And this is where it gets very confusing. And remember, river corridors are where about 80% of our damages occur. So like the place that we should definitely be considering regulation are largely currently unregulated. roughly 10% of towns following Tropical Storm Irene adopted some river corridor bylaws that essentially said, we will not develop anymore in the river corridor, recognizing the risk to public safety and the cost to taxpayers. That was incentivized through various state programs for a while, and we saw a big uptick right after Irene. People realized these are not places that we want our communities, our neighbors to live. These are not places that we want critical infrastructure or roads. But after a while, I think the flood amnesia set in, and asking again, it happens.
Yeah.
After a while, that sets in, and asking towns to take on another regulatory burden that's different from entirely FEMA's floodplain program is, and has proven to be really challenging. So we really tapered off at around 10% of towns. Within those 10%, I would say it's even lower of who's actually able to enforce, because who has the staff capacity or time to enforce that, and remember when somebody comes in with a zoning permit, that's another thing they should be thinking of. So the state has tried to incentivize this financially, to say, please stop developing these areas. And that has proven largely ineffective. Protecting river corridors is in a litany of state plans over the past 15 years. It improves water quality, significantly decreases financial burden, supports towns, etc. So, you know, whether it's the Forest Action Plan, the Lake Champlain TMDL plan, the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, it's kind of just everywhere that we need to be limiting development in these areas. But it hasn't yet happened until last year. Another place where they are regulated, so those 10% of towns, state-owned buildings and facilities. When Act 250 is triggered, they get a review, and that means that a permit goes to the Rivers Program staff at DEC, but they do not actually have the authority to thumbs up or thumbs down that development. They can just say, that's in the river corridor, we strongly recommend against development there. But that can be, that recommendation can be heeded or not. So there's no real regulatory authority via Act 250 triggering currently. And just important to note that a lot of Act 250 permits go into that office, and those staff don't receive any of those permitting fees, so it's kind of just like free work that they're doing on top of their general fund budget and everything else that they have to navigate. And then finally, when section 248 for large review projects gets triggered, they get review priority. So it's miasma, and it's very confusing, and asking especially rural communities to navigate this has been exceptionally challenging and has led to development in really concerning places. I pulled images from each of your districts. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was not hard. It is not hard to find damage in nearly every single one of your towns. Starting at the top, Shrewsbury. Or the top left, moving over to the top right, is Hardwick. Down the bottom corner, we have Woodford. These are all erosive flooding images, so you can see the amount of chaos and trauma that can occur. In the middle, Starksboro, and off to the bottom corner is Plainfield.
This was Irene.
These are different flood events. Yep,
Starksboro was last summer.
last summer's flood, yep.
It's Plainfield
Same with
last.
Plainfield. Woodford, and
That's really close up.
that one's from Irene.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, down.
I think the Shrewsbury was last summer storm. Shrewsbury gets hit fairly regularly, actually, Hardwick all the time. It's it. And so just to really capture how widespread these damages are, that they can happen in our really developed areas, Plainfield and Hardwick, those are both like down in the villages. Or up in our highlands where you don't even think that a tiny brook, like in Starksboro here, could cause chaos, and yet that home now is sitting on a cliff. That's exceptionally vulnerable.
I didn't even know there was a brook back there.
Yeah.
Until it happened.
Yeah.
It's like,
You've done that about a lot in my area.
That's how you find out that there's a small little stream
Yeah,
that
it
came.
just exploded that one night.
yeah.
Yeah, it really does. And And because of the velocity, especially those that are up in the mountains, it brings, as you imagine, like a lot of debris down into our villages.
Tons of sediment.
Boulders, trees, all of those things that then wind up, if they're not able to be trapped upstream, in our villages and downtowns. This is not the type of damage that you would expect with FEMA flooding, the inundation flooding. So these images are just a really stark reminder that just using FEMA floodplain mapping as our development North Star is very misguided, and has created a lot of harm and chaos. 80% again, river corridor, 20% floodplain, and using like federal highway administration and FEMA related damages, all of which are just damages, most of which are damages just to public infrastructure. This is costing Vermont taxpayers over $30 million in filling our flood problem. And we need to change where we're going. We're seeing a lot of interest in the state buyout program for homes that are flooded or flood vulnerable. Importantly, using that example back with the Rutland's VSP barracks, that structure would theoretically be eligible for a floodplain buyout because buyouts are largely funded through FEMA. And the only way that you can get FEMA funding if you're not in a floodplain is if you've experienced substantial loss, which is more than 50% of the value of your home. We're spending tens of millions of dollars, or there's tens of millions of dollars in interest every year in property buyouts across the state. We're also running up against a huge housing crisis, so even those people who want to get out of harm's way and stay in their communities or stay in Vermont have nowhere to go.
Is that the FEMA funding you just mentioned?
Yeah,
Did you say that you have to get 50% if you're outside of the floodplain?
you're outside of the
Yeah,
floodplain and
yeah.
yes, because they don't,
Yeah.
right, substantial damage,
Okay.
termination. Yeah. So you have to be hit really hard, like this image from Linden. And this was from last year's flooding too. So, what changed in recognition of this regulatory patchwork regulatory system we have, in recognition of the public safety threat that river corridor flooding presents, in recognition of the fact that we just need to be building safer housing for Vermonters that would cost taxpayers less in the future. Act 121, or Vermont's Flood Safety Act, was passed last year. It's not just a bill about river corridors. There are provisions for river corridors, floodplains, wetlands, and dams. I think you heard a bit about wetlands last week. I'm certainly not going to speak to dams or wetlands today, the provisions within. I'm happy to answer any questions on the river corridors and floodplains pieces, but generally, I was here to kind of explain to you the biggest shift in the Flood Safety Act from my perspective, as somebody who's been really close to erosive flooding in Vermont since I moved here following Tropical Storm Irene, is the changes that you all created via the river corridor provisions. It shifts the regulatory burden from towns to the states. The Vermont League of Cities and Towns came in and even testified that we don't normally want the state to take away regulatory authority. This one is too onerous and too dangerous, and public safety belongs at the hands of the state. It represents an immense public safety benefit, huge future burden on taxpayer dollars reduction, because we're going to no longer be developing these largely undeveloped tracts of the corridor. And even though I'm with the Nature Conservancy, I genuinely put these in the order of things that I care about. The river function and health of our river, water quality benefits, which will have an economic value, like those will also benefit from the changes from the Flood Safety Act with respect to the river corridors. And I hear you all have a lot of free time. I'm here to offer even more because I'm done, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes, we do.
So I wanna make a statement, but it's gonna end up in a question, I promise.
Okay.
I've been around,
I'll listen for it.
I've been around for a while, I grew up in the same town, I still live there. And in 1976, the Water Resources Board of the state of Vermont approved filling in part of the river, Pulteney River, because the D&H Railroad was their loads were increasing and they needed more stability in their trestles. So state estimates were that the floodplain was gonna be raised 1.7 meters. And the DNH said, no, it won't be that much, it'll be, less. Well, ended up, it did raise it, and they did approve it. So since the 27 flood, a lot of the landowners used to have, they'd get a pocket of gravel would fill in the river, they would go in and they, with their excavators, when they got to the low water level. And they would dig that out, and it was a source of bank run gravel, basically, for sale. We can't do any of that anymore, and because the river is gonna go where the river is gonna go. And I understand that, Act 121, you can't even really go into a river bed now. If a tree falls in there, you can't even go and remove the tree, but what's the vision for Vermont as far as the homes that are already there? A lot of those guys in the last July flooding in the town of Wallingford, which is in my district, they had already had been a claim for their flood insurance through FEMA. And now, because they didn't move, they can't, they're done. They fixed whatever they could because they were in a mobile home or couldn't afford to go anywhere else. So I get it. Eventually, all those buildings in the floodplain will be moved. But in the interim, what are we gonna do? What's the state gonna do? That's my question.
I'm happy that I was able to track all of that. Oftentimes I'm like, where's the
Yeah.
question? So thank you.
Yeah.
First, a friendly amendment that Act 121 doesn't address river management or dredging. There are emergency protective measures within the rivers program, rules and procedures that allow for debris removal following an event that are exacerbating or creating more vulnerabilities in towns. But generally, it might be helpful to understand, like, thinking of when a rain drop falls, like in the top of a mountain, that will eventually make its way down to our villages. We have historically managed our river. We've tried to dredge and straighten them and keep them confined in a way that we're essentially trying to make our water move off of our landscape and through our town as quickly as possible. Where water, when it's in its most stable state, rivers, we want them to move as slowly as possible. That allows more flood storage. The more we can do that up in our headwaters and in our forests, the better. If we can keep as much water up there, there will be less water in our downtowns and villages. The debris that you were just mentioning, and I talked about before, when boulders start moving and trees, that's actually generally very good for risk reduction. If those trees fall, like traps water behind it and keeps it from hitting our downtowns and villages. The problem arises when, so like in this image actually here, these trees being here and not close to like a culvert that it might plug is actually very helpful. Water will slow down and get trapped before it does get to those places. It's when they are like imminently upstream of a culvert following a disaster that we are able to remove it. To the broader question about what are we doing for those places that have already been developed? The floodplain provisions in here, there are a couple of things that will hopefully create new statewide building codes or minimum standards for those towns that are in the National Flood Insurance Program to say, like, if you are going to do substantial improvements or if you're going to build a new structure in the floodplain, here are some things that you should do differently so that your property is a little less wet. But for the river corridor piece, it's really, unfortunately, wait until, in this image here, wait until the bank gets so close to your home that you can get a FEMA buyout because of imminent threat of landslide failure or slope failure. It is people and their extreme trauma that they carry from floods just being willing to take a financial hit and move. I mean, it's not good, and that's why we have to stop putting people in these places. And the more that we can prevent development in these like largely undeveloped areas, the more we're able to flood those areas where there isn't development, and that prevents the flooding in our up and downstream communities.
Every farm was built on the side of the brook because of the water.
Right,
Every town was built on the side of the river because of the mills.
absolutely.
So, 50 years from now, the landscape should be changing. I mean, look at Montpelier.
Yeah, so Montpelier is a great example because you all are familiar with it. The river goes, if you look on an aerial, it's like as straight as can be. It's as abnormal and unnatural as a river could be. But we're not changing that. We're not going to move the whole city of Montpelier despite every time there's a flood, there's interest. That would cost trillions of dollars in infrastructure, and the state already is required to protect investments where we've managed rivers. So the river will not be able to move that easily in places where we've done this. It is extremely expensive to continue to manage the rivers the way that we have. It does not necessarily make a place any more safe or less safe. But for our downtowns and villages that have been densely developed, there is already a lot of like river management that will continue, and yeah, they're required to enforce it.
In the meantime, the state of Vermont, I found out, does own dredges. And they still, I mean, there are places that, while we're waiting for that 50-year period, that we could go and affect that flooding for the downtown, that would make a difference, but nobody seems to want to do it.
Yeah, it's because dredging, if it causes an immediate benefit, like day of, literally, it will backfill. I've heard people describe it as like when you're walking on a beach and you're right next to the water's edge and you dig a hole and like 30 seconds later it fills back up with more water and sediment. That's effectively what dredging does in our rivers, and it just does I move the water away from this thing that I care about faster, but it creates immense trouble downstream, and the public safety and really like liability to other property owners is pretty extreme if you do that type of work.
In that 50-year period, though, it might save a lot of money until we get there, till we move the buildings out of the flood.
Unless the rivers are, we can talk more about it. I'm just thinking about, the flooding that we've had 2 years in a row.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So what about, have we analyzed, on a statewide basis or regional basis, or whatever, all the pinch points that make flooding worse, culverts, bridges that are too small? And because I know that that doesn't answer everything, but what you're talking about is the real answer, but we also have those pinch points that
Absolutely,
make flooding a lot worse,
yeah.
especially, so do we know where they all are, and have we begun to do cost estimates for what it would take to, do we have a prioritization of which ones to change out and make bigger ones? We finally did one near my house where the road walked out constantly because it's a culvert. They finally replaced it with a box culvert, wider than much. It's pretty cool, actually. Because all kinds of things that we had were not with culvert. But how much of that is, so what's the?
So V-Trans has a really incredible mapping tool called the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool. Last I checked, it wasn't the full state, but it might be now. And they've gone in and identified those structures that are undersized and at risk of not only damage to themselves, but creating more damage up and downstream. And it also is a really neat tool because when you click on a culvert or an area of interest, it will show you the different mitigation actions you can take. And it isn't always necessarily the most cost effective to upsize a culvert, because there are 15 downstream and 15 upstream that are also undersized. And so if you make one bigger, you're not really that imminent area, sure, but then it says like, actually, these would be appropriately sized if you could drop the floodplain in this one area because it has been filled in, whether it's been burned by a railroad, which is very common in Vermont, or historic flood and infill has gone in. That allows for, that's really cost effective because it makes all 30 of those culverts, they're probably okay because we created that floodplain.
So V-Trans has it on town roads as well, includes town roads.
I believe for some of them it is, but I would have to
Okay.
definitely fact check that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are we actually doing anything with it?
when funding is available. Something that Vermont did that was really remarkable following Tropical Storm Irene was like a 5-year battle with FEMA, that eventually allowed us to change what FEMA would pay for essentially following a disaster. Generally, FEMA public assistance funding that goes to blown out culverts and infrastructure allows you to replace the kind.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, it's already been damaged, it's just gonna get damaged again, FEMA, we're gonna come to you in 2 years, the next time it floods. Our state codes and standards require that we make them larger. 5-year battle, lots of people having to go from state government down to DC to have this battle. And FEMA finally acknowledged and will now honors our codes and standards, so that means when there is a flood and a public road has been damaged, we're able to use federal funds to upgrade that. So that's been like a wait until it floods because then the feds will pay for it, which isn't a great strategy. And yet, the number of undersized culverts and bridges we have in the state's budget isn't going to support it, town budgets certainly aren't going to, so. One flood at a time kind of has been an approach.
So the regional planning commissions, they had a MPRG. Municipal road, and basically a lot of the flooding happened because. The culvert upstream was too small or cross drain.
Yeah.
Into nomenclature, right? And FEMA came in and said, until you upgrade all these roads, back roads. To the correct size cross drain or culvert, that we're not gonna give you any more funding, so the state did take that on, in one municipality. And then the flooding we had last summer. I know Senator Hardy asked me, he said, you guys didn't get affected in Rutland County, Western Rutland County. No, because we actually had gone out and done the culvert and cross drains and fixed the roads. To make the difference, I mean, we had some damage, but we didn't have it anywhere near as much as some did, so.
That's great.
So that's a great program,
Yeah,
and I think the regional planning commissions did a good job implementing it.
Yeah, they have, our regional planning commissions have been like.
Yeah.
Incredibly effective and helpful for our towns, especially in navigating. Flooding and access to federal and state funds for homeowners and infrastructure projects.
And the natural resources conservation districts work with them to take care of that too.
so right.
Sure, I just wanted to mention, I'm sure you already knew about this, but Vermont culverts.org. I'm looking at it right now, it's a pretty cool website that there are 112,428 culverts in Vermont. 2,490 bridges. And 14,355 culverts in urgent, critical, or poor condition. So this has really cool maps and charts and everything, so you can look at all the culverts. And I learned about this, just in case they're listening, from the town of Ripton, who was like, had massive flooding, and their culverts and bridges were all wiped out in 2023. They got more rain than any town in the state, and I was like, how do you know where to go? And they're like, there's a map, there's a website. So this has been around for a while. I think it was the legislature required it in 2005 or something like that. So anyway, that's cool. You can check it in your district.
That's very cool.
To do
A
that.
lot of the towns didn't do anything because the culverts were so expensive. I mean, they actually had to
They are.
do an inventory of what they needed, and then they went to the state, and the state gave them some help to get, so they could purchase them.
Yeah, and it's overseen by V-Trans, so if you wanna learn more, we can have that.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And it's VT Comforts.
It's, yeah, VT culverts and sound, sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
It's okay, I was just looking it up just then.
Yeah.
Great, any other questions? So, you know, I do want to come back to this vision question of where we're going. You know, if the state is now regulating river corridors and there's a sort of a base set of regulations for municipalities for inundation flooding for FEMA purposes. I just want to state the obvious, right, that it seems so obvious to build in like around river corridors because they're flat, because, they're, it seems easy, and it's just exactly the place where we should not be building. And so, just thinking about what is the space for what needs to be done next, like thinking about state buyout programs. I think about places that like Plainfield, had substantial damage, that's a technical term, that they had a.
They had that
They
technically.
did, yeah, so, thinking about the hit to their grant list that they're taking, and if we have more flooding, more municipalities are gonna be at the risk of seeing their grant lists go down, particularly if they do buyouts,
Oh, yeah.
right? And so I'm trying to think about like how, what do we do? Like, how do you have some thought about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could do is if that land is effectively, there's no ground values, it's the state choosing it for a floodplain.
Yeah.
Put it in the pilot.
Oh, so instead of even current use as like a flood,
Well, I mean, operationally, it'd be the same thing,
mhm,
but if the town is giving away grand lists
yeah,
for the purpose of, providing flood capacity, which helps everybody,
yeah,
put it in the pilot.
that is a fascinating question. I would love to talk more about that.
Yeah, yeah, they're
Yeah.
their insurance, as you can imagine, agencies, and I'm going like way over my skis here, because money and finance are like, ooh, in my brain. And child of 2 CPAs, so I like cut that off real quick. But because of the cost of flooding and knowing that flooding is becoming more extreme and more severe, especially in the Northeast. The reason that FEMA even owns the National Flood Insurance Program is because the private insurance industry is like, nah, we're always going to be in the red.
Yeah.
So the government has to step in and support that. There are private insurance industries now that are looking into like creative impact finance mechanisms and like, how do you look at the value of reestablishing a floodplain and the flood reduction value that can have, so you don't actually have to change the infrastructure or the downtown development area because you've created this upstream space where a lot of that water can be stored and slowed. That's all being discussed at like federal, international even levels as like sea levels rise, et cetera. So I think it's a great question and recommendation to start thinking like really creatively about, especially how we use our largely undeveloped land to keep slow and store water in like a way that is valuable both financially and emotionally for.
Yeah, thinking about like, how do we value this land for its function of slowing down river, slowing down water? Yeah, right.
So then, going back to that culvert on the Fulton River,
Mm.
Fulton actually applied for a Gallup Brook grant, being
Great.
through the state of Vermont to do a study, which they did, and I guess they were gonna decide Monday night whether they're gonna spend any more money to actually correct some of them. Because basically what they did is they built berms so that the property on the side of the river downstream didn't get flooded. Well, they think that if they can undo what the D&H did, and oh, by the way, Agency of Transportation owns those from the D&H rail trail. So if they can get money from the federal government to open that back up again, that would cut, it would actually lower the flood point upstream. And the prevalent attitude in my town was, because the river travels from east to west. Well, that's just New York State, don't worry about it. Well, it's affecting somebody downstream, and everything we do affects somebody downstream. So,
And everybody upstream affects us.
that's right.
I feel like that is just like a good ethic.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean, that was just kind of prevalent.
State line is just a line.
Still people over there.
yeah, right.
Since we're sitting here, if you have your Give us a little refresher on 121 about how it unfolds now for the next few years,
Oh, sure.
and we'll just start there.
Yeah, so the reason I.
I'm asking this part for solving the reason I have to talk about it before the long. Helpful.
Nice slides, nice photo.
We have that, by the way.
You do, yeah, or you should, I hope.
Okay, that's fair.
It was definitely there from last week. So the reason I said there should be a little asterisk here, that's the old regulatory framework, it's technically still in place because of the process of making the rules. There is a 2-year education and outreach effort that's attached to the river corridor piece of this, because it is a big change, which is like, we need to go out to private property owners, municipalities, basically anybody that owns or lives on land, just say everybody in Vermont, and let them know that this shift is coming and why it is, and really take the time to talk about why river corridors are so dangerous. So that's a 2-year effort. Then there's also a mapping provision, again, speaking to the river corridor piece of this, that says, it addresses that very issue, like what about in our really developed downtowns where we're clearly going to keep trying to invest development, because that's where all of our infrastructure is, stormwater, wastewater, et cetera, et cetera. We're already managing the river, like surely we can find places there that are safer or less destructive. So there's a mapping effort that looks at where within our existing settlements as defined in statute, do we think that you can still develop within a river corridor while protecting a largely undeveloped river corridor? So mapping, education and outreach, then there's rulemaking provision, that's also 2 years. And that is to kind of use what we learned from the mapping exercise, what you learned from education and outreach hearing for Vermonters to inform the development of the new rule with the eventual end goal of there being a general permit that the rivers program at ANR manages and is responsible for. And that's slated to begin sometime in 2028. So until 2028, anybody in those 90% of towns that haven't adopted river corridor bylaws can continue to develop in those areas. And because of development pressures, because sometimes it seems surface value literally and metaphorically like a good place to build. I think we can anticipate that people will continue to build river corridor until that general permit takes place. So that is hopefully the education and outreach campaign that precedes it can help deter people from those areas until, but that's the general thing.
Talk about the general permit a little bit, but what that might look like and the requirements that are, I realize we don't have a count.
Yeah, well, I mean, it'll all be determined via rulemaking, but I think it will be kind of a culmination of the recognition that there are these new infill maps, those places that say within existing settlements, here's where we think it's okay. And that might look like a green, yellow, red zone, like definitely this place is okay. Yellow, let's have the DEC river scientists go out and like assess whether or not this is a good spot. Or red, like, no, we're not going to issue or make it develop here. Within largely undeveloped reaches of the mapped river corridor, and again, this act only touches the mapped river corridor, so those smaller streams up and higher communities that are considered unmapped are not covered in this, even though they can be just as destructive. They will look at saying like general permit, yes or no, that's an area that we're not allowing development.
I know you want to, I'm sorry, it's like just one word. I have one town where people are worried about like, you know, because they don't even live, so they're worried about other, you know, sheds in their backyards.
Yeah,
I think of a little shed in their backyard.
that's all gonna be worked out in rulemaking, and I think, yeah,
I think it's some sort of standard and then how the have the permitting process for that or?
so currently in statute, they use the FEMA definition of development, which is like pretty broad. And I think education and outreach will inform like, yeah, obviously, we're gonna allow people to build garden boxes. If a garden box gets wiped away, you've lost your vegetables for the season, but you haven't created downstream harm. If you're creating like an ADU or accessory dwelling unit, like that actually would be deeply concerning. It would probably be a no. It's those things in between that I think will be worked out through rulemaking of what's in and out.
Thanks, that's totally fine. The education and outreach, who are the targets for the education and outreach? I would assume that there's various populations that you would want different education and outreach for.
Yeah, so there are actually like key stakeholders listed in statute, I cannot ramble them off the top of my head, but like. Municipal government, the agricultural community, environmental justice populations, there are like 10, I think, that are listed. But I think, I mean, the DEC is going to have to navigate how they wanna do the education and outreach campaign. But I'm assuming it's yes to all of those 10 groups that were identified in statute and then some.
Okay, I just think that developers I would assume they would have to have very technical, specific education and outreach, because there's a project that's happening right now in Middlebury, pretty close to the river. It's actually a new childcare center, and
We need those.
yeah, exactly. And my first question when I saw the design was, is this too close to the river? You know, and the designers were like, no, it's fine. So I would hope that.
But again, like, is it fine?
I don't know, I don't
There?
have it, it's
Right.
Otter Creek, and so I haven't seen this map for Otter Creek, or,
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, it wasn't flooded in the last few years. In none of these major events has this area been flooded, but it is quite close to the river and it could always flood in the future, so that's my question about, making sure that developers and.
Really good point, because developers largely probably look at FEMA maps, because that's how they understand the risk. I hope that a childcare facility might have triggered Act 250, so your river staff might have been able to provide recommendation.
Probably did.
Yeah.
Before, we have another question here, but before sorry, I wanted to interrupt you.
Yeah.
If somebody wanted to look up these maps for themselves in a location, like anywhere, I assume it's in like ArcGIS.
Yeah, it's on the Agency of Natural Resources, Natural Resource Atlas, which is accessible. You don't have to have GIS on your computer. You can just search a location specifically and then toggle
And these are just
put the
layers.
recorder on, put the floodplain on, let's
Okay.
see what it looks like in this area.
Yeah, so you could find it pretty much anywhere in Vermont.
You can find the map of recorder anywhere in Vermont, because DEC did that work. FEMA floodplain, you can find in most places, but like I said, again, speaking to Wardsboro, FEMA coming out and remapping takes a long time. That means a lot of towns in Vermont, and as you can imagine, it's usually our more rural communities, especially when you think about the Northeast Kingdom. They haven't had digitized maps made by FEMA, so it's like you have to go to the town office or FEMA's website and like look at what looks like just like a really granular map that doesn't have any aerial imagery. So most of the state will have both of these. I mean, Wardsboro is very rural too, but there are places that will not have the FEMA maps defined.
I remember seeing those maps last year that looked like they probably came out on like a dot matrix printer.
Yes,
And I'm like, oh gosh, this is the most outdated.
and that's what our town
Version
has
that
to
we have.
navigate right now.
Yeah.
It's, yeah.
Sorry, Senator Williams, go ahead.
There was a program, I understood, I was on the select board in the town, and if you had property that was in the floodplain. And the property owner was willing to move to tear that building down, that the state, I understood, would give money for the appraised value of the property of the home. Is that still in effect?
Yeah, that's part of the mostly FEMA funded buyout program.
Okay.
There are state funds that can be used to match it. It has to be allocated by you all. But yeah, that's part of the program. It's like you assess the value of the home or appraise the value of the home, and then you get fair market value. And if your home was flooded and damaged, you get the fair market value the day before the flood happened.
Is anybody advertising that? Because I think
Yeah.
the people that have been flooded out a couple times might want to take advantage of it.
I
If they
think
knew more about it.
the buyout program is like pretty well known now. I mean, Vermont Public has done a lot of stories on it. Vermont Emergency Management that navigates that program where I used to work, they've done a lot of outreach on it. The RPCs are intimately familiar with the buyout program and communicating it to town, so. It is still there, federal funding is a little confounding in this exact moment in time, so we'll see what happens with FEMA and. Yeah. I'm trying hard, confounding, to know, you know, what impacts, if any, will come to the FEMA mitigation funding, which Vermont has, definitely been very successful at, capturing for Vermonters.
That's great. Cool, any other questions? Okay, super, thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so we're.
Yeah, you as well, for your community. It's rough out there.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm looking this up right now on the map. The map is pretty cool,
The map is.
yeah.
So as it turns out, we had one blank spot on our agenda already, and then another person canceled, so we're actually done for the day, so you have.
The day.
Well, for this committee. Right, I was gonna say, other obligations for other things, but, so with that, any other comment? Okay,
I have been here for a week and once I
yeah.
almost got fishing while ago.
Oh,
Because we got a presentation they're doing in the
oh, really?
on beavers.
Oh.
We've got fun.
Oh.
But
Yeah.
I'm going up there right now to watch the rest of it.
So, but
Oh.
it didn't quite work. I tried to do a quick improvement.
Is that something we should position?
Are we, adjourned? I think we are